Hello friends, today in our issue we will present you the following events: severe flooding in the United States of America. The remnants of Storm Ophelia hit 3 U.S. states, including New York, flooding subways, streets, and houses. Everything is covered in water. We'll also cover the aftermath of flooding in Turkey and Greece, war between the U.S. and China over pandas. World media are actively discussing Beijing's decision to take all bears from American zoos. The UK has started searching for vandals responsible for cutting down the famous Robin Hood tree. And finally, we'll tell you about a striking house built by a Georgian sculptor out of sea stones. Let's go! With horror, Americans are following the events in New York City, where the east coast of the United States was engulfed by the remnants of Storm Ophelia. 3 states are facing widespread flooding. Directly in New York, the situation became particularly critical, and a state of emergency was declared due to flash flooding. The most severe situation was in the neighborhoods of Brooklyn, Manhattan, and Queens, where streets, basements, and first floors of buildings were underwater. Roads and alleys turned into rivers, and hundreds of cars were stuck in spontaneous streams that formed on what used to be busy thoroughfares. Traffic was also suspended on FDR Drive, a major artery in eastern Manhattan. Heavy rains have forced the suspension of one of the city's airports, and the subway is not running on several branches. The governor of New York, Kathy Hochul, called the current storm dangerous for life in the metropolis, as up to 31 centimeters of rain fell in the last few hours. The streets are almost empty, which is certainly unusual for such a densely populated city, but they are filled with garbage and cars. Locals compare it to the apocalypse and the end of time. Authorities are blamed for what happened without distinction by party affiliation, including current U.S. President Joe Biden, as well as former leaders of the country, Trump and Obama. But it wasn't just New York City that was hit by the natural disaster. In the neighborhoods and settlements of New Jersey and Connecticut, the situation is a little better, but still difficult. According to local media, a total of 23 million Americans have been affected by the bad weather. At the moment, the intensity of the rains has slightly decreased, and the authorities are urging people to stay in their homes. Repair services and rescuers are actively working across the city to fix the problems. In this situation, there is also a risk of increased widespread flooding on the East Coast caused by the supermoon. And already Turkey is faced with dealing with the aftermath of the collision with Storm Elias, which caused widespread flooding in and around Istanbul. Under the influence of heavy rains, the storm drainage system failed to cope with the load, and powerful streams of water began flowing through the streets. Cars became blocked in the water, and some of them had to be lifted with cranes. This caused complete paralysis of road traffic. Pedestrians also faced severe difficulties as the water currents carried them off their feet. Infrastructure was also affected by the flooding, with basements, first floors of buildings, and underpasses inundated with water. In one 24-hour period, emergency services received more than 1,500 calls for help. Forecasters' predictions are not comforting, as a new batch of rainfall is expected in the region in the coming days, which can only worsen the situation. The governor of Istanbul, Davut Gül, has not even ruled out the possibility of evacuating people from areas where there is the greatest risk of flooding. Residents of Greece are gradually recovering from the latest events. More than 3,000 people were evacuated due to unusually heavy rains. One of the most affected regions is Thessaly, as well as the city of Volos, which barely had time to recover from the consequences of the previous flooding caused by Hurricane Danielle about a month ago. This time, the new cyclone, also named Elias, brought with it an incredible amount of rainfall. Meteorologists report that in just 24 hours Greece has received rainfall exceeding several monthly norms. In Volos, for example, as much rain fell in 14 hours as normally comes in 8 months. Villages and roadways were flooded, some roads washed away, and water flooded homes and stores. Authorities had to cancel classes in schools and put emergency services on high alert. It was also decided to bring in the military to deal with the aftermath of the disaster. However, at the moment, the authorities remain cautious in forecasting the time of liquidation of the consequences, given the unpredictable nature of the disaster. A conflict over pandas between China and the United States is emerging, and the world media are actively discussing this event. The reason for the conflict was Beijing's decision to return all pandas from American zoos, which led to headlines of this kind. According to information from Bloomberg, there is a high probability that as early as next year there will be no giant pandas left in the United States. Experts point to bilateral tensions between China and the United States as the root of the problem. As for specific details, the 3 pandas living in Washington, Mei Xiang, Tian Tian, and their cub Xiao Qi Ji will return to China by December. The pandas also remain in Atlanta, but they too will likely return to China by the end of next year. China has a monopoly on large pandas and leases them to other countries, which has become part of panda diplomacy and an indicator of relations between China and other nations. Scandal erupted in the UK where unknown vandals cut down one of the most famous trees in the country, the Robin Hood tree. Yes, this is the same tree known from the 1991 movie starring Kevin Costner, Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. This famous spot was one of the most popular subjects for photographs in the UK. It was several hundred years old, and in 2016, it even won the title of Tree of the Year in England. However, someone deliberately cut down this tree. Northumberland County Police have announced an investigation into the alleged deliberate act of vandalism. Once again, we present to you our regular feature where we tell you about the ordinary people among us. Today our story takes us to Georgia, where we get to know an incredible house built by sculptor Boris Papasqua out of sea stones and shells on the coast of Poti. Take a look at what this amazing construction looks like. It took the master 22 years to create this unique dwelling. Sculptor Boris Papasqua and his wife moved to the coast in the 90s during the military events in Abkhazia. Initially they bought a small old house, but then Boris decided to build a more spacious dwelling with his own hands. Interestingly, even after the completion of the house, this enterprising man is not going to stop. His main dream is to be able to enjoy the view of the sea, so he plans to build a viewing tower. Boris claims that he will not stop working until he realizes his cherished dream. Friends, of all the stories in this issue, which one impressed you the most? Do you sympathize with the ordinary Americans, Turks and Greeks affected by the floods, or for some reason is it hard for you to empathize right now? What do you think of the panda war between the US and China? Do you think it is symbolic and fair in light of Beijing's actions? And, of course, what are your impressions of the house built by a sculptor from Georgia out of sea stones and seashells? Do his golden hands impress you? Please share your opinions in the comments. May peace and goodness accompany you and your families, and remember that we must always take care of our common home, our planet, always keeping humanity with a capital letter.